world is faced with new interconnected challenges which require our concerted efforts to resolve. The transcontinental and transboundary dimension of these challenges requires us to be ever more innovative in our collaborative efforts.
Innovation in our collaborative efforts is key. That was one of the major themes to come out of the 2016 BRICS Summit in Goa, India. The emerging market bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa pledged to enhance consultations and coordination on the G20 agenda and promote issues of importance for developing economies. But each of the 5 countries has its own internal problems, which in turn are coupled with a global economic slowdown. So how can BRICS ensure effective implementation of the programs it supports in Africa? And how can South Africa leverage its role in the bloc for the maximum benefit of the continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. BRICS countries used to lead the world's economic growth, but as the global environment has soured, these emerging powers have also slowed, and analysts now say the countries must face the economic challenges on their own. But at the closing of the BRICS summit in Goa last week, Chinese President Xi Jinping called on BRICS nations to cement confidence amid these challenges and work together for further development. Let's take a look at the broader context and the outcomes of the summit.
It's been a difficult year for the BRICS nations. China's growth has eased, a slump in commodity prices has dragged Russia and Brazil into recession, and South Africa could be the next country to slip into stagnation. Only India is managing to keep the balance and growth expectations up. According to the International Monetary Fund, India is due to expand 7.6% this year, while China could pull off growth rates of 6.6%. South Africa's GDP growth stands at 0.1%. while the growth rates of both Russia and Brazil remain in negative territory. Exports have been key to the BRICS countries' expansion, but now that foreign demand has slumped, the 5-nation bloc has turned to new opportunities. For example, the BRICS Development Bank, set up last year to lift investment. Bank officials say infrastructure development projects could help create domestic demand.
The development of infrastructure is an important growth lever. Infrastructure contributes significantly to economic growth. So we see ourselves in a modest way contributing to that effort to stimulate the emerging market economies again.
The 5 BRICS nations account for 40% of the world's population and 30% of the world's territory. But each of the countries has its own issues to contend with. Brazil faces high unemployment and high inflation amidst political turmoil. Russia is mired in low oil prices and Western sanctions. South Africa needs to attract more foreign investment, and China has to shift its growth model towards being driven by the services industry and technology. India is the world's fastest growing country, but still suffers from stifling bureaucracy and underdeveloped rural areas. This year's BRICS summit concluded with the adoption of the BRICS Goa Declaration, which seeks to increase commercial cooperation to create wealth in all 5 nations. In order to further bridge the gap in the global financial system, the nations have agreed to fast-track the setting up of a BRICS rating agency. Chinese President Xi Jinping said protectionism has no place in globalization. To promote trade and development in all 5 nations, stronger cooperation is needed.
Some countries are more inward-looking in their policies. Protectionism is rising, and the forces against globalization are posing an inherent risk. Furthermore, we have to confront complicated geopolitical factors intertwined with traditional and non-traditional security risks and rising global challenges such as terrorism, infectious diseases and climate change.
Over the 2 days, the leaders of BRICS nations deliberated over issues that impact their own countries as well as the world at large. What started as an economic grouping is now also a bloc that corroborates on geopolitical issues and other concerns. Matthew Edwards, CCTV.
The BRICS New Development Bank President K.V. Kamath has said that the summit will help build a strong and interconnected bloc. He added China has played an important role in pushing forward the operation process of the bank. He spoke to CCTV's Su Yuting.
The world economy has been very sluggish, and also that the economic growth has been very slow. There are huge challenges facing the BRICS countries. So what role do you think that the new development bank will play in boosting the economic recovery of these countries?
As I say it, economic cycles are always present. They keep going in swings, up and down. And at this point in time, there is a slightly downward spiral, particularly in the commodity industries. But these, as we've seen in the past, are always temporary. So the new development bank is really built for the future as the BRICS countries, and hopefully in course of time other countries go through these developmental needs. At this point in time, our belief is that some of our members could be impacted by the commodity cycle, but it's going to be short-lived. Has strong growth, and I'm sure growth will be strong on a larger base in China, and growth will be strong on a slightly smaller base in India, and indeed in our other member countries. And we look forward to assisting the upcycle as it starts turning very soon.
Well, the G20 summit has just concluded and resulted in plenty of roadmaps on global economic governance. So what will be the specific measures to be taken by the NDB to further implementing the consensus reached by the G20 members during the Hangzhou summit?
I believe the NDB is a response to the new governance paradigm that the developing countries wanted. The developing countries clearly wanted a paradigm where countries of the South, countries which were developing, had a voice. And that voice is embodied in the New Development Bank. And that is what we are now increasingly hearing at fora like the G20 and so on, the call for what I would say global governance.
How do you assess China's role in the establishment of the NDB and also its operation process?
I would think that China has been a wonderful host, and I would think it would have been significantly more difficult for us if we did not have a host as supportive as China has been. Both China as central government and Shanghai as our provincial government and host city have been extremely helpful and cooperative in enabling very many things for us which otherwise could have put us back by maybe a year or so. So I have to thank our hosts for all the welcome they were given the team.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will offer their analysis of the 2016 BRICS Summit. To stay with us.
The new development bank is one of the key outcomes from practical cooperation among BRICS countries. 1 year since its opening, the bank has achieved considerable results. China is willing to work with other countries to better facilitate the bank's projects and to build its brand. We want it to be a model for global development institutions.
A model for global development institutions. That was Chinese President Xi Jinping speaking of the BRICS Development Bank. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to offer their analysis of the outcomes of the 2016 BRICS Summit in Goa, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg. Cyril Prinsloo, he's a researcher in the Economic Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. In New Delhi, Jabin Jacobs, he's an assistant director of the Institute of Chinese Studies in India. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Jabin Jacobs, in New Delhi, I'll start off with you. The BRICS Summit in Goa ended on Sunday. First of all, what were your overall impressions of the outcomes of the summit?
Well, if you look at the BRICS Declaration, it is a huge document covering a gamut of issues. The range of issues covered shows really the potential of the BRICS Forum in the political, economic, as well as development sectors. The challenge for the BRICS grouping really is now implementation. Previous declarations have also been quite long, and to cover such a large range of subjects is all very well, but if the grouping is not able to implement, to follow through, then we have a problem on our hands. But the fact that the grouping is so diverse, I think, is also both a challenge as well as an opportunity.
Right. Cyril, South Africa is the only African member of the BRICS grouping here. What stood out for you, particularly in relation with African issues or with South Africa itself?
Beatrice, I think we've clearly seen how South Africa has driven the African agenda within the BRICS grouping. And very clearly, before Africa joined the BRICS, there were no mention made of Africa as such within their declaration. As soon as South Africa participated in the BRICS groupings officially, all of a sudden we saw African issues also coming onto the agenda of the BRICS countries. But I think we have to remember that this is ultimately a group of emerging countries. So many of the challenges that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, face in terms of development, many of those challenges are shared across Africa countries as well, across the developing world. And I think in that sense, really this group championing those kind of issues, it really stands to benefit African countries as well as other developing countries as well.
Right. David, do you agree?
Yes, certainly. I mean, this is the so-called South-South cooperation that sort of prioritizes the challenges that the South faces, and it sort of gives a laser focus on some of the issues that have been within the global discourse for a long time, but haven't been completely or comprehensively addressed. And so the BRICS offers a unique opportunity for not only the issues of Africa, but also other developing nations to be, dealt with comprehensively in a manner that, a lot of Africans, for instance, have been out there advocating for.
Right. Jabin Jacobs, of course, people are going to be asking 8 years on, though, and with the slowing down of the global economy, is the BRICS grouping, though, still the flavor of the day?
Well, yeah, that's a tough question that, the BRICS countries must ask themselves. But again, to come back to the range of issues that have been discussed, I mean, you saw the ministers of infrastructure, science and technology, environment, health, education, agriculture, all of these ministerial meetings taking place either in the run-up to the summit or during the summit itself. So, the question is whether the BRICS grouping can actually extend cooperation and synergy on these issues through the year. I mean, this is a very unique grouping, and insofar as Africa is concerned, it's not often that a member state of Africa has a preeminent or a prominent, equally prominent role as other members in any multilateral grouping. So in that sense, I think this is a grouping that has much potential. And like I said before, the fact that it is diverse, creates challenges. David just mentioned 4 countries which are actually developing countries, but Russia is a bit of an outlier. But that apart, the fact that such a different grouping of countries with sort of from different parts of the world can come together also means that they have a set of they have a bunch of opportunities before them to tackle issues very differently from the way other multilateral institutions, multilateral groupings have done.
Right.
So I think that's where the key is, whether BRICS can see itself in a much more ambitious role.
Right. Cyril, let me get your view here, because you did mention about the impact that South Africa within the BRICS grouping has had on the African continent. Of course, so what's been that impact, though, for Africa itself?
I think if we look at the BRICS agenda, one of the key things they're trying to address is inequalities in global governance systems, right? Of course, we saw last year the establishment of the new development bank to really change the way that development finance is being done. Of course, we know in Africa, financing infrastructure is a massive challenge to growing economies, to creating sustainable development. and the BRICS as a group said, you know, they want to look at how they can better finance infrastructure. So by creating these new systems, you know, better understanding the challenges of developing countries, they can certainly look to better address these challenges through the creation of these systems.
Right. David, has the BRICS impact, though, been felt in Africa, being an initiative for the South-South cooperation?
I think it's too early to begin to look at impacts. But certainly one thing that is certainly interesting to note, even from the declaration, is that the BRICS have taken into account the Africa's Agenda 2063, and you know, throughout, you know, in all the challenges that they've raised, from infrastructure, energy, to science and technology, and even agriculture, they seem to be in tandem with the priorities of Africa as articulated in the Agenda 2063. And so in a way, perhaps there's potential for positive impacts should this cooperation live out to its expectations.
Right. Cyril, I want to come back to South Africa's role here and its mandate for Africa. Has South Africa, though, been given a mandate by Africa to sort of push forward Africa's agenda within the BRICS groupings, or has South Africa taken that upon itself, or is South Africa only defending its own interests?
You know, I won't say there's been an official mandate for South Africa to represent the continent. But of course, the rest of the continent is a very big priority for South Africa. If the rest of Africa is doing well, South Africa will do well, right? So South Africa is always, not only in the BRICS, but equally we see in other multilateral forums such as the G20, where South Africa champions not only its own interests, but clearly drives also the interest of African countries. Some of the common development challenges around infrastructure, these kind of challenges South Africa take to the global stage. And of course, I think, you know, as one of the biggest economies on the continent, South Africa also has a responsibility to not only look after its own interests, but equally to some extent represent other African interests as well.
Right. David, do you agree?
Yes, certainly. You know, and I agree with what the panelist Cyril is saying, that indeed, in spite of there not being a formal mandate, but you know, that Africa gives to the South Africans, I think in the, you know, in their participation in these forums, at least they take with them the development challenges that Africa faces, and indeed the rest of the developing world. And so in that sense, I tend to agree that they do have a responsibility to go out and articulate those challenges.
Right. Jabin Jacobs, you did talk about the issue of divergent views within the group's countries themselves. In this regard, there are divergent economic issues here, divergent political issues here within the BRICS grouping. How do they reconcile this interest, though, with their interests when it comes to dealing with Africa? For instance, China and India are major economic players on the African continent.
See, there are divergences, but you know, if you think big, these divergences are also responsible for a great deal of creativity. You know, in the past, Africa did not have agency. African countries did not have agency. But now with the arrival of the BRICS nations, with the BRICS grouping, in maybe challenging other groupings as well, Africa has a greater opportunity to put its interests forward. And even if you break it down, between India and China, there is a fair degree of rivalry, competition within the African continent. But again, that also creates choice for African nations. And I think one needs to look at it that way as well. Plus, you know, the fact that India and China as emerging countries, as fellow developing countries, has countries that have some of the same problems that our African countries have, is also a reason why many new and unique models of interactions have developed. I mean, to take one example, at the BRICS summit, there were the meetings of sister cities, for example, or this trying to promote the idea of sister cities between the countries of the groupings. I think that's a great idea. We need to have more sister-city cooperation, linkages between African cities as well as cities in India and China. Similarly, questions of local bodies, development, how to, meet common challenges of urbanization, of development in the cities. I think, and this is an important trend for Africa as well, because both India and China as well as Africa are increasingly urbanizing. So yes, there are going to be political issues, there are going to be economic issues, but for all these countries to put their heads together,
right.
BRICS gives that opportunity, and I think that's where the real strength lies.
Do you see, though, David, do you see a convergence of views between the major powers in the BRICS grouping? Do you see a convergence of views when it comes to dealing with African agendas?
I think to some extent there is, and this is the reason. The context of global governance today has had some imbalance, in the sense that if you look at the Western world, seem to have a much wider voice in determining aspects of trade governance and so forth. And so with the emergence of BRICS and them setting up institutions such as the Development Bank and even ratings agencies, they sort of are hoping to perhaps increase the democratization of voices within this global architecture of trade governance. And so in a way, in spite of the diversity of interests within the BRICS itself, there is some positive move toward greater and even more democratic global governance.
Well, Cyril, the whole question of institutionalization was one of the issues that was considered. This whole issue of the new development bank, though, how do you see Africa aligning its interests? How do you see Africa benefiting from the development bank?
I think a key thing, as we know, the new development bank started about a year ago. In its first year, it achieved some significant successes, by providing loans to 5 of its member countries, by raising its first bonds. And we know in the next year, the bank is going to try and firstly set up its African regional center here in Johannesburg, South Africa. And secondly, it's going to look to expand its memberships. And I certainly think African countries can lobby to firstly participate in the African Regional Center, have dialogues with this center on their needs, on their challenges, and secondly, they can lobby to become part of the bank, to actually have a say in the bank, to be able to benefit from this new institution. So certainly I think there is direct scope for African countries to engage with the new development bank.
Is there direct scope to engage with the new development bank from developing countries and from Africa as well?
I think what Cyril has mentioned is important to note. It's up to African member countries to lobby to become part of the bank, and this can be through membership, so that they can have a stake and even benefit from whatever facilities that the bank designs.
Right. I want to get a final comment from all of you, though. And Jabin Jacobs, to you first. Ultimately, from where you're sitting, what was the message that the BRICS grouping did send out in the end?
The message really is of the possibilities. This, for Africa at least, I think there is greater choice that BRICS offers. And as long as issues of accountability, transparency, and openness are evident in dealings with the BRICS, between BRICS and African nations, whatever the issue that is taken up, I think then BRICS makes a difference and Africa achieves difference from what interactions are generally like with other multilateral institutions. I mean, the question is of giving the developing South agency, and BRICS achieves or helps or tries to achieve that goal. And in that sense, I think Africa-BRICS relations should be on the upswing.
Cyril Prinsloo in Johannesburg.
For me, the key thing was the institutionalization of the group, exactly because 4 of the BRICS are currently facing a range of domestic, economic and political issues. So really, to me, the Indian presidency, and I think India really drive this home, was that we need to further institutionalize the BRICS to consolidate the agenda, to further cooperation. And to me, that was the big takeaway from the Goa BRICS summit was further institutionalization of the group, even amidst this challenging economic and political time for the group.
David?
Yeah, I agree with my 2 co-panelists. I think what I might add is the operationalization of some of these institutions, where we begin to see not only a move towards beginning to address the challenges that are faced within Africa, and these are challenges that range from the energy requirements, the infrastructure deficits, to challenges within agricultural production and participation of the industry within the global value chains. I think that is a very positive step, and that sort of begins to address the challenge that has been developing the South-South cooperation.
Right, gentlemen, thank you, and we leave it there for this week. That's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa, but thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Cyril Prinsloo, he's a researcher in the Economic Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. In New Delhi, Jabin Jacobs, Assistant Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies in India. And with me here in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. But do remember, you can join the conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. Goodbye.